Hey guys, tonight we're settling in for a long, drowsy walk through the halls of history. So grab a blanket, dim the lights, maybe sip some tea if you're feeling fancy, and let's drift back to a time when royal children, those precious heirs to mighty dynasties, were about as fragile as porcelain dolls left out in a thunderstorm. Because here's the thing, for all the pomp, gold, and armies that kings and queens commanded, they were remarkably bad at one very basic thing: keeping their children alive. Heirs, especially the ones meant to inherit whole kingdoms, dropped like flies before even reaching adulthood. And the reasons? Well, they're a mix of poor medical care, medieval germs, and some good old-fashioned dynastic inbreeding. So tonight, we're going to float through some of the saddest, strangest, and occasionally ridiculous cases of royal children who were supposed to secure the future of their kingdoms, but barely made it past the nursery. And don't worry, we're not going to be rushing. We'll drift from one story to the next, as calm as possible. Let's start gently with the Middle Ages. Because if you wanted a crash course in how not to raise a healthy child, medieval Europe really had you covered. For one thing, they didn't exactly understand germs. The medical advice back then was, let's just say, creative. If a royal baby was sick, the court doctors might bleed them with leeches, force-feed them herbs, or even try astrology-based treatments. Which is basically the medieval version of saying, yeah, Mercury's in retrograde, so let's drain half the kid's blood and see what happens. And of course, royal families loved showing off. If you had a baby prince or princess, you didn't keep them safely tucked away. No, you paraded them around, surrounded them with courtiers, and stuck them in drafty castles where every passing nobleman could sneeze directly onto the royal cradle. Hygiene was not exactly a priority. Bathing? Rare. Clean hands? Optional. Sharing goblets of wine with toddlers? Sometimes encouraged. So right off the bat, we've got a perfect recipe for high infant and child mortality. And because these kids weren't just any kids, they were the future of dynasties. Their deaths could throw kingdoms into absolute chaos. Which, honestly, seems to have happened so often that you start to wonder if medieval monarchs were cursed. Spoiler, they weren't cursed. They were just bad at parenting in the era before antibiotics. One of the earliest heartbreaking examples comes from England. Henry I of England, who ruled in the early 1100s, had a son named William Adelin. William was the golden boy, the only legitimate son, the heir everyone pinned their hopes on. The dynasty literally depended on him. And then at age 17, he drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120. Now, technically, William made it past childhood, but he was still under 18 and still young enough to count as a royal tragedy. His death sparked what's called the Monarchy, a decades-long civil war in England, all because one heir didn't survive to take the throne. So yeah, royal childhood deaths weren't just family tragedies, they were political earthquakes. But William's case was almost neat compared to what came next. Because sometimes heirs didn't even get the dignity of a big dramatic ending. Sometimes they just wasted away in the nursery. Let's float over to the 13th century French court for a moment. If you think French cuisine is refined now, wait until you hear how they treated their royal babies back then. King Louis VIII and Queen Blanche of Castile had several children, and not all of them made it. Blanche, to be fair, was pretty dedicated. She personally oversaw the upbringing of her surviving son, who later became Louis IX, that's St. Louis for those keeping score. But before Louis IX made it to adulthood, several of his brothers and sisters died young. And here's where we see the pattern again and again. The ones who survived usually did so because they had insanely protective mothers or just dumb luck. The ones who didn't, they often succumbed to the great medieval killers, measles, smallpox, dysentery, or infections from what should have been minor injuries. Imagine being a royal kid, playing in the castle yard, scraping your knee on a stone. Today, you'd slap on a Band-Aid and maybe some Neosporin. Back then, that scrape could easily turn septic, and before long, you're the subject of a tearful funeral procession, and the kingdom is arguing over succession. Now, here's where it gets extra sad, but also kind of absurd. Royal families, because of their obsession with keeping the bloodline pure, married their cousins a lot. And by a lot, I mean so much that family trees started looking less like trees and more like tangled knots. This was especially true for the Habsburgs, that famous dynasty who seemed to think genetic diversity was optional. In Spain, for instance, there's the case of Don Carlos, the son of Philip II. Don Carlos technically made it past 18, but only barely, and he was basically a medical disaster. Inbred to the point of genetic meltdown, he was sickly, mentally unstable, and reportedly had one leg shorter than the other. His childhood was marked by illness after illness, and if he's the lucky one who survived to adulthood, you can imagine how many of his less fortunate cousins didn't. This constant inbreeding meant that royal babies weren't just fragile because of germs. They were fragile because their DNA was already stacked against them. It's hard to survive childhood when you're carrying double the genetic baggage of the average peasant. And peasants, by the way, had their own high infant-child mortality rates. But here's the ironic twist. Sometimes peasant children had a better shot at survival than princes and princesses. Why? Because peasants weren't subjected to bizarre medical treatments, weren't paraded around sickly courts, and weren't genetically strangled by cousin marriages. They had rough lives, yes, but their kids at least had sturdier immune systems. Okay, so let's drift over to England again, because the Tudors were basically a dynasty defined by dead children. Henry VII and Elizabeth of York had several children, but only a handful survived to adulthood. Their firstborn, Arthur, Prince of Wales, was the golden heir. Everyone expected big things. Instead, he died of some mysterious illness at age 15, just a few months after marrying Catherine of Aragon. And with Arthur gone, the crown eventually passed to his younger brother, Henry VIII, the man who gave us 6 wives, 2 beheadings, and a whole religious reformation. So think about that for a second. If Arthur hadn't died before turning 18, England might never have had Henry VIII as king, which means no Anne Boleyn, no Elizabeth I, no Church of England, all because one teenager caught a fever and didn't make it. That's how fragile dynasties were. And speaking of Henry VIII, let's not forget his own disastrous record with heirs. He desperately wanted sons, but his children dropped like flies. His son by Jane Seymour, Edward VI, technically inherited the throne, but he was a sickly child his entire life. He coughed, wheezed, and wasted away until he died at 15. Which, once again, threw England into chaos, because heaven forbid the Tudors have a smooth succession. So, if you're already noticing a theme, you're not wrong. Royals placed enormous importance on heirs, but they weren't very good at keeping them alive. Castles might look glamorous in modern photos, but they were cold, damp, and filled with smoke from fireplaces. Not exactly the best environment for newborn lungs. Royal nurseries were often drafty chambers with tapestries that trapped dust and mold. So, before germs even entered the picture, these kids were breathing in what was basically medieval mildew. And then came the food. Baby formula wasn't a thing. Sometimes queens breastfed their own children, but more often, royal babies were handed off to wet nurses. And the milk? not always fresh. Sometimes it was mixed with bread or even wine to help digestion. Spoiler, it did not help digestion. It just gave the poor baby stomach cramps on top of everything else. So yeah, if you were a royal infant, your odds weren't great. We'll drift a little further forward in time because by the 17th century, you'd think things might have improved. Spoiler again, not really. Take the Stuart dynasty in England. James I's daughter, Elizabeth, had 13 children. Only 2 made it past childhood. That's not bad luck, that's just statistics in a pre-vaccine world. And in France, Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, had a similar problem. Despite being surrounded by all the splendor of Versailles, most of his children with Queen Maria Theresa died young. The heir who...
All right, let's settle back in. Deep breaths, calm mind, because we're about to stroll deeper into the endless line of tiny crowns, heavy expectations, and very short lifespans. Remember, we're not rushing. This isn't a sprint. It's the world's slowest funeral march through royal childhoods. Let's start in Spain, because if you want a dynasty that consistently sabotaged itself, the Spanish Habsburgs really went for gold. Or maybe bronze. Definitely not silver, because silver would have implied something shiny and functional. So, picture the 16th century. Philip II of Spain, the guy whose empire was so big they said the sun never set on it. You'd think a man who ruled half the world could manage to raise a couple of healthy kids. But nope. Out of all his children, very few actually made it to adulthood. His son, Don Carlos, the crown prince, was technically not one of the under-18 crowd when he died. He was 23, but you could argue that medically he never left childhood. He was short, hunched, frequently ill, mentally unstable, and reportedly once tried to roast a servant alive. Cute kid, right? The inbreeding had caught up to him. But here's the sadder part. His other children didn't even get that far. Many of them died in infancy, victims of the same Habsburg family tree that looked more like a scribble than a proper branch. And this was the pattern across Spain for generations. Royals who either died as toddlers or who survived just long enough to remind everyone that inbreeding wasn't a great long-term health strategy. Now, let's float gently over to France again, because nothing says tragic heir like French royal history. Louis XIV, the Sun King, famously ruled for so long that everyone around him seemed to die first. His heir, his son, died of smallpox. His grandson died of measles. His great-grandson also died. By the time Louis XIV finally kicked the bucket, the only person left standing to inherit was his 5-year-old great-great-grandson, the future Louis XV. So basically, Versailles turned into the royal version of a daycare center, with a toddler suddenly holding the crown of France. Not exactly what you want in a country that was constantly one tax revolt away from disaster. And here's the kicker. Little Louis XV was himself a very fragile child. People weren't sure he'd live past the age of 10. He did, barely, and went on to rule for decades. But the fact that he only got the throne because nearly every other Bourbon heir had keeled over before 18, well, that's French succession in a nutshell. Now, if we slide over to England again, because the English royals just loved repeating the same mistakes, we land in the Stuart dynasty. Take poor Mary, Queen of Scots. She had one son, James VI of Scotland, who later became James I of England. He survived, yes, but it was basically a miracle. As a baby, James was sickly, weak, and constantly at risk of dying. His doctors kept predicting his funeral, but somehow he hung on, grew up, and eventually united the crowns of England and Scotland, which was very lucky because otherwise the English succession crisis would have been even messier than usual. But while James survived, many of his extended Stuart relatives did not. Charles I's children, for instance, several of them died young, either from disease or the stress of being political hostages during the English Civil War. Because nothing says healthy childhood like being locked in a damp castle while your father is being tried and executed. And speaking of damp castles, let's talk about Russia, because the Romanovs had their own catalog of tragic heirs. Ivan the Terrible, for example, had several children. Most of them died young. His only competent heir, Ivan Ivanov, died before reaching the throne after his own father supposedly struck him in the head during a fit of rage, which, let's be honest, is a very Ivan the Terrible thing to do. The other surviving son, Fedor, was described as mentally feeble and barely fit to rule. He did technically make it past 18, but only just, and he left no heirs. So once again, we see how fragile dynasties were. One cough, one fever, one bad swing of a temperamental czar's staff, and the whole succession line collapses. Now, let's take a quiet pause and consider something. Why exactly did royals die young so often when they had the best food, the best clothes, and supposedly the best care? Well, here's the sleepy truth. Best care in the 14th or 15th century basically meant whatever your court physician read in a dusty Galen manuscript written over 1,000 years earlier. Royal doctors loved treatments like bloodletting, purges, and enemas. Basically, if you were a sickly prince with a fever, the doctor's first idea was to make you weaker by draining your blood or giving you laxatives, which is sort of like saying, "This horse looks tired. Let's just chop off its legs and see if that helps." Combine that with drafty nurseries, moldy tapestries, and hand-me-down genes from cousin marriages, and you've got the perfect storm for early funerals. Okay, let's drift to Austria, where the Habsburgs perfected the art of producing heirs who didn't survive. The most infamous example, of course, is Charles II of Spain, sometimes called the Bewitched. He technically lived into adulthood, but his childhood was a long, miserable list of medical disasters. He couldn't walk until he was 8, couldn't speak properly until he was nearly 4, and was generally considered so fragile that the court assumed he wouldn't live past adolescence. Spoiler, he did, but his children? None, because he couldn't have any, which meant his entire line ended with him, sparking the War of the Spanish Succession. Once again, a child's fragile health ends up changing the entire map of Europe. And it wasn't just Europe, by the way. Let's float eastward for a moment. In Chinese imperial courts, child mortality was also a massive issue. Ming and Qing emperors had dozens of children, but only a handful made it past their teenage years. The Forbidden City, with all its grandeur, was still just another breeding ground for epidemics. The Kangxi Emperor, for example, had over 50 children. A stunning number, yes, but a shocking portion of them died in childhood. Even in a palace, stuffed with servants, doctors, and rituals, disease didn't care. A measles outbreak could cut through the imperial nursery like a scythe. And just like in Europe, every death meant another scramble for succession, another ripple in politics that could shake entire empires. Back in Europe, things didn't get much better even as medicine technically improved. Take the Hanoverians in Britain. George II's eldest son, Frederick, the Prince of Wales, was supposed to inherit the throne, but instead he died at 44 from what may have been a burst abscess on his lung. His own eldest son, little Prince George William, had already died at only 3 months old. Another child, Princess Louisa, died at 19. So again, the line of succession staggered its way forward through funerals, skipping over heirs like stepping stones that crumbled before anyone could stand on them. Now, let's slow down and linger on one especially tragic dynasty, the Tudors. Because honestly, they're the poster children for dead children. We've already mentioned Arthur, Prince of Wales, dying at 15, and Edward dying at 15. But what about the children who barely made it into history books? Henry VIII's daughters by Catherine of Aragon included several stillbirths and miscarriages. These lost children never even got names, but each one represented another nail in the coffin of Henry's marriage. His desperation for a living son shaped the entire religious history of England. Think about that. Babies who didn't even survive long enough for a christening ended up altering the fate of a whole nation. Even when Henry finally got his son Edward, the boy's fragile health left everyone in a constant state of worry. Imagine trying to run a kingdom while simultaneously tiptoeing around your heir like he's made of glass. That was the Tudor reality. So what we're seeing over and over is this. Royal children weren't just kids. They were symbols. Their survival or their failure to survive decided wars, reforms, and dynastic shifts. But at the end of the day, they were still just kids. And kids, especially in pre-modern times, had lousy odds. It's almost ironic. Royals lived in castles, wore silks, and ate at feasts. But none of it could buy them what they really needed. Basic, modern medicine.
So let's ease into Spain in the 1600s. Spain at this time was still clinging to its golden age, though to be honest, the gold was beginning to tarnish a little. Endless wars, too much silver flooding in from the Americas, and the usual Habsburg problem, marrying cousins until the family tree looked less like a tree and more like a very small bush. Into this complicated moment came Prince Baltasar Carlos of Spain, born in 1629. His arrival was greeted like the dawn of salvation. His parents, King Philip IV and Queen Elizabeth of France, had waited a long time for a male heir, and now finally, here was the little boy who was supposed to carry the entire empire on his fragile shoulders. From the moment of his birth, Baltasar Carlos was less a child and more a symbol. The painter Diego Velázquez was practically on speed dial, creating portraits of the young prince in miniature armor. Imagine a 10-year-old being forced to pose as a hardened general, clutching a commander's baton like he even knew which end was up. It was adorable in a way, but also tragic, because it showed how little childhood royals actually had. Every toy was political, every outfit propaganda. The truth was, Balthazar was never very healthy. He struggled with fevers, fatigue, and a weak constitution. But that didn't stop the Spanish court from parading him around as the savior of the dynasty. And then, in 1646, at the age of 16, he fell ill while traveling with his father. Within days, he was dead. The cause is still debated: typhus, smallpox, maybe scarlet fever. But whatever it was, Spain's golden hope evaporated overnight. His father was devastated. Velázquez painted one last portrait of Baltasar Carlos posthumously, which is really just a polite way of saying, here's a very expensive reminder that our heir is gone. Spain never really recovered from his death. The succession became shaky, marriages were renegotiated, and the cracks in the empire widened. All because one fragile boy didn't survive the nursery curse. Now let's take a slow stroll across the Pyrenees, into the glittering but equally fragile court of France. If Spain had Baltasar Carlos, France had Louis, Duke of Burgundy, the grandson of the mighty Sun King, Louis XIV. Born in 1882, Burgundy was considered the light of the Bourbon dynasty. Unlike many royal children, he actually made it past the toddler years,
which was already seen as miraculous. The court whispered that he was clever, religious, and, unlike his grandfather, perhaps even kind. Imagine that, a French king who might not have been a tyrant. For a while, it seemed promising. He married, produced children, and was poised to carry on the dynasty. But then came the winter of 1712. Measles swept through the French royal family like wildfire. Within weeks, Burgundy, his wife, and 2 of their children were dead. Just like that, the carefully built dreams of Versailles collapsed. The throne eventually passed to his surviving son, who became Louis XV, but as a toddler, which meant France, yet again, was ruled through regents and courtiers bickering over power, while the actual heir played with toy soldiers in the corner. The French nursery, like the Spanish one, was less a cradle of stability and more like a revolving door of disappointment. Now, let's drift a little further back in time, to England at the end of the 1400s. Here we meet Prince Arthur Tudor, a boy whose very name was a statement. His parents, Henry VIII and Elizabeth of York, named him Arthur, after the legendary King Arthur, hoping to link their shaky new dynasty with Britain's mythical Golden Age. Subtle, right? Nothing like setting impossibly high expectations before the poor child could even walk. Arthur was raised to be the perfect heir. Tutors taught him Latin, theology, statecraft. At 15, he was married off to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, in what was supposed to be the marriage that tied England securely to Spain and to Europe's great powers. The wedding celebrations went on for days, with jousts, feasts, and dancing. Everyone agreed the future of England was bright. Except it wasn't. Within months of the marriage, Arthur was dead. The sweating sickness swept through his household, and the 15-year-old heir was gone almost before anyone had memorized his handwriting. Catherine was left a widow at 16, and history took a wild detour. Arthur's younger brother Henry became the heir, married Catherine himself, and eventually became Henry VIII, the man who tore England away from the Catholic Church because he couldn't stop cycling through wives like a bored man at a banquet. So Arthur's short, fragile life had enormous consequences. His death set into motion a chain of events that changed not only England, but the entire religious map of Europe, which is a lot of weight to put on one boy who barely made it out of adolescence. Now, let's wander north, where the cold winds of Scandinavia swept through royal nurseries just as cruelly. In Denmark and Norway, royal children were raised in drafty castles, bundled in fur, and given tutors from Germany or France. But even here, fragility was the rule. Prince Christian of Denmark-Norway, born in 1603, was groomed to rule 2 kingdoms. He was well-educated, dutiful, and carefully monitored. Yet despite all the effort, his health never held. He died before ever taking the throne, leaving behind a dynasty scrambling for its next hope. Denmark's royal nursery was no more secure than Spain's or England's. And finally, let's head east into the vast, snow-dusted palaces of Russia. If you thought the mortality rate was high in Western Europe, Russia put them all to shame. Here, infant and child death was almost expected. Ivan the Terrible himself buried multiple children. The Romanovs later did the same. Royal births were celebrated with cannon fire and bells, but in the back of everyone's mind was the silent question, will this one survive? More often than not, the answer was no. In fact, so many heirs died young in Russia that the throne was left wobbling. When Ivan the Terrible's only surviving son died without an heir, Russia plunged into what they literally called the time of troubles. Civil war, famine, pretenders to the throne, because the nursery just couldn't deliver someone to sit on the throne for more than a few years. And so across Europe, we see the same story. Cradles filled with gold thread and silk sheets, tiny hands clutching silver rattles, mothers whispering prayers, and then silence. A christening 1 month, a funeral the next. For royal families, this wasn't unusual. It was Tuesday. The cruel irony is that these children, dressed in jewels and painted by the greatest artists of their time, lived shorter, harsher lives than many of the peasants in the villages outside their palace gates. Wealth couldn't buy immunity from measles or scarlet fever or dysentery. Sometimes the luxuries themselves, the crowded palaces, the over-attentive doctors with their leeches and bloodletting, made survival even less likely. So when we talk about royal heirs who barely made it out of the nursery, we're really talking about an entire pattern, stretching from Madrid to Moscow, where dynasties rose and fell, not through wars or revolutions, but through the fragile lungs of infants who couldn't survive the winter.